Today, I'll be talking about how works-based salvationists fall short, a biblical perspective. Now, many people believe that in order to be saved, they need to add works to their faith. They think that salvation is something you can earn by doing good deeds, following religious rules, or obeying the law perfectly. But is that really what the Bible teaches? Let's look at some commonly used verses that are often taken out of context to support this idea. The first verse we examine is James 2:24. So James 2:24, for example, reads, "You see then how by works a man is justified, and not by faith only." Now, on the surface, when you look at this verse in isolation of surrounding verses, and you take this out of context, it sounds like James is saying you need to have works to be saved, right? But when you look in the whole chapter, the whole passage, within its full context, James is actually talking about how true faith results in works. It's not the works that saves us, but the faith that saves and leads into a transformed life. Again, it has nothing to do with heaven or hell. It's just showing that a faith that is profitable unto men, right? Now, let's look at Ephesians 2:8-9. It clears it up. That works never determine salvation at any point of a believer's life. For by grace you are saved through faith. That is not yourself, it is a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. Salvation is a free gift of grace, which cannot be earned by human effort. Now let's continue to break down some other verses that false prophets, false teachers, and many unsaved people will misuse to teach works-based salvation. Let's look at Matthew 7:21. And it reads, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father which is in heaven." Now, people usually argue about this verse, thinking that it says you have to do works in order to do God's will in order to enter heaven. But we need to read further with other scriptures throughout the Bible to give clarity. And good news for us, for my watchers and listeners out there, Jesus clarified what God's will is, and that is to believe in Him. And John 6:40 reads, "And this is the will that sent me, that he who believeth in Him may have everlasting life." It's faith that brings salvation, and only faith results in doing God's will. To believe in Jesus is doing God's will. Alright, now Philippians 2:12 says, "Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." Now this is commonly twisted to mean you have to work for salvation when we take it out of context. But notice the word says work out. It didn't say work for salvation. It said work out of salvation. So you work out of being saved, not to get saved. So this means live out salvation that God has given you through His grace. Now next verse, Philippians 2:13 says, "For it is God which worketh in you, both the will and to do good pleasure, His good pleasure." So you see, it's God who's doing the work through us, and that's not of ourselves. Alright, so let's go over the standards of law and condemnation. So here's the real kicker. If you believe that works are necessary for salvation, then that means logic follows you are bound to keep every single law with 100% perfection. So if you're saying you have to have works with your faith, you're saying you have to be sinless to get to heaven. That's what these works-based salvationists are saying. But James 2:10 reads, "For whoever shall keep the whole law, and yet fail in one point, he is guilty of them all." What a massive standard to put on people, right? If you broke one commandment, you're guilty of breaking all of God's law. Of course, no human being can meet that standard on their own. Now, Paul illustrates this in Galatians 3:10. "For many are the works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, Cursed is everyone that continueth not in all things which are written in the book of life to do them." In other words, if you try to rely on works, you're putting yourself under a curse because you will never, ever measure up to God's perfect standard. Alright, but there's good news. God knew nobody can fulfill his law with 100% perfection because no one is sinless. Which is why God sent his son, Jesus, to fulfill the law when we couldn't. Romans 3:20 tells us, "Therefore by deeds of law no flesh be justified in sight, for by law is the knowledge of sin." So the law reveals our sin, and it shows that we need a savior. That's the purpose of God's law, not that you try to keep it to be saved. Quite contrary, it shows that you need a savior because you can't keep it. Romans 4:5 sums this up very beautifully. "And to him that worketh not, but believeth on him that justified the ungodly, his faith is counted for righteousness." You see, it's faith in Jesus that justifies us, and never by our works. Jesus did all the work on the cross. Our part is then to just to believe and trust in that finished work. So as I'm going to wrap this up, we've seen that works will never save us, and it cannot save us. And trying to earn salvation puts a person under a heavy burden that nobody can carry. But the amazing grace of God offers salvation freely to all those who believe in Jesus. So if you've been struggling with the idea of quote-unquote earning your way to salvation, rest in the truth that salvation is by grace, through faith, and no amount of works at all added to what Jesus has already accomplished. So, if you find this video helpful, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message of God's grace today. Till next time, keep growing your faith and keep resting in the finished work of Christ. God bless.